The street where he lived was usually quiet. It's the kind of place where people walked their dogs in the evening and waved at anyone who passed by. He had chosen this neighborhood because it felt peaceful, not fancy or perfect, but steady, calm, and predictable. For years, that was exactly what he got. Life moved at a slow pace, and he liked it that way. He kept to himself, did his work, minded his home, and treated everyone with respect. But sometimes, even the most peaceful places can change without warning. It began with small things. Things he didn't take too seriously at first. One morning, as he walked outside to throw trash in the bin, he saw a piece of paper taped to his front door. It looked official at first glance, printed in bold letters as if it came from someone with authority. It said he had parked his car incorrectly and needed to immediately correct the violation. He stood there for a moment, a little confused. He hadn't done anything wrong. His car was parked exactly where it always had been, the same way everyone else parked. It wasn't blocking a driveway or sticking out into the street. He looked around the neighborhood, wondering if someone was joking with him. A few houses away, 3 people stood together, talking quietly and glancing in his direction. He didn't know them well, but he recognized them. They were always walking around the neighborhood, acting like they were checking things, pointing at houses, peeking into yards. He had seen them do that for months, but he never thought much of it. Everyone had their own habits. People were free to walk where they wanted, but as they stared at him now, he felt something different in their eyes, something between pride and challenge. He took the note off his door, folded it, and went inside. He didn't feel angry. Mostly, he felt confused. But confusion wasn't enough to ruin his day. He placed the paper in a drawer and went on with his normal routine. He believed the best way to live was to stay calm and not jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone put the wrong address. Maybe one of the neighbors was having a bad day and needed something to complain about. A few days passed. Things seemed normal again. Then another paper showed up. This time it was about his yard. According to the notice, his grass was overgrown and not maintained at community standards. He laughed a little when he read that because he had trimmed the grass just 2 days earlier. It was shorter than most lawns on his street. Again, the same 3 people were outside, standing together, watching. They didn't wave. They didn't even pretend not to stare. He couldn't ignore the strange feeling anymore. Something wasn't right. But he didn't want to start a fight over grass or parking. Life was too short to waste energy on arguments that didn't matter. So he simply kept doing what he always did, taking care of his home, being respectful, and staying calm. He didn't respond to the notes. He didn't confront anyone. And in his mind, he hoped the whole thing would fade away. But people who believe they have power never stop when they think someone is ignoring them. Sometimes that makes them push even harder. A week later, he received a 3rd notice. This one was longer, written with sharper words. It said he had failed to comply with multiple guidelines and that further actions would follow. It warned him about possible penalties and future inspections. The strange thing was, the paper never mentioned who was sending it. There was no name, no signature, nothing that showed it came from any official group. It looked serious. But it was missing the important details that real notices always had. He held the paper in his hands for a long moment. Something inside him finally shifted. Not anger, not fear, just a sense that he should start paying closer attention. He wasn't the kind of person who liked digging into problems, but he wasn't helpless either. Life had taught him that staying quiet didn't mean he was weak. It meant he chose peace first. But if peace failed, he knew how to stand firm. Later that evening, he took a slow walk down the street. He didn't bother anyone. He just looked around at the houses. He noticed something he hadn't before. Several homes had the same kind of paper taped near the door, some faded under the sun, some crumpled on the ground. One house had 3 of them layered on top of each other. He wondered why no one had mentioned it. Were people scared? Did they think the papers were real? Or did they just want to avoid trouble? He stopped by the house of an older resident who often sat outside on a small wooden chair. The man waved him over, smiling. They had spoken casually a few times, but never for long. When he asked about the papers, The older man sighed as if he had been waiting for someone to finally ask. He said the same group those 3 people who walked around every day had been calling themselves leaders of the community for almost a year. They had no legal authority. There was no active association. Nothing they claimed was official. But they acted confident, used strong words. Most people didn't want to question them. The older man said he had thrown every paper they gave him straight into the trash. They can talk as much as they want, the old man said, but talking is all they have. His voice was calm, but there was a tiredness behind it, as if he had seen this kind of thing before. People trying to control what they didn't own, people pretending to have power because no one stopped them. That conversation stayed with him the entire night. He kept thinking about how easily people believed something when it looked official, even without proof. He wasn't angry at the group, but he felt something close to disappointment in how quickly people could be misled, and how loud voices sometimes drowned out truth, but he didn't jump into action. Instead, he chose to observe quietly. He wanted to understand what was really happening before deciding what to do next. He paid attention to when the group walked around, what they looked at, and who they talked to. He noticed they avoided houses with people who challenged them. They only targeted the quiet ones, the ones who kept to themselves. The ones who didn't like conflict. He realized they had mistaken silence for weakness. Days passed, and he collected every paper they put on his door. He kept them neatly stacked, reading each one carefully. The more he read, the more obvious the truth became. None of the notices had any real authority behind them. The words looked strong, but the foundation was empty. One afternoon, as he came home from the store, he found all 3 of them waiting in front of his house. They weren't smiling. One of them held a clipboard, tapping it with their finger as if preparing for a performance. They said they needed to review his recent violations and inspect the property. Their tone was loud, as if volume alone made them important. He stood there, calm as always, listening until they finished. When they finally stopped talking, he simply said, "I don't think you have the authority to inspect anything." They looked stunned for a moment, as if no one had ever said that to them before. One of them began insisting again, trying to sound official, but he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain why he believed what he believed. He simply said, "If you have real documents, you can show them to me. If not, please don't leave papers on my door." His quiet tone threw them off more than shouting ever could. They exchanged confused glances, then walked away without saying much. For the next few days, they avoided his house. But power, even imagined power, is addictive. It didn't take long before they tried again. More papers appeared. More bold words printed without names or signatures. More attempts to control him through intimidation. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't bothered anymore. He wasn't stressed. He saw everything clearly now. He was no longer confused or unsure. Instead, he felt steady, grounded, and ready. He knew the truth was on his side, and the truth had a way of coming out eventually. One evening, he met another neighbor who quietly admitted they had been feeling bullied by the same group for months. They were afraid to speak up. They didn't want trouble. He listened patiently and encouraged them to stay calm. He assured them that things would soon change, even though he didn't yet explain how. The group kept pushing harder. Each new notice grew more dramatic, filled with warnings that made no sense. And with each one, he simply added it to the growing stack of papers inside his drawer. What the group didn't know was that the more they tried to show power, the more they exposed just how powerless they truly were. He didn't plan to embarrass them. He didn't want a dramatic showdown. He simply wanted peace, real peace, not the kind controlled by fear. But sometimes, peace requires standing up in quiet, steady ways, and as part 1 closes, the balance in the neighborhood is shifting. The group believes he is still the quiet, powerless resident who won't fight back. They think they have control. They think they are untouchable. But what they don't know yet is that truth is slowly rising behind him, piece by piece, paper by paper. And the moment it comes out, everything they built on intimidation is going to fall apart. Everything is already changing slowly. quietly, and inevitably, because he has finally stopped being a silent observer. He has begun preparing. And when the truth finally comes forward, nothing in the neighborhood will be the same again. The days that followed felt strangely heavier, even though nothing dramatic had happened yet. It wasn't the kind of heaviness that came from fear or stress. It was more like the feeling someone gets. They know something is building behind the scenes. The group continued walking around every morning, holding their clipboards as if they were inspecting a huge company instead of a quiet neighborhood. They pointed at houses, whispered to each other, and sometimes stopped in front of his home just long enough to make their presence known. He watched them only from the corner of his eye, never reacting, never confronting them. Silence made them uneasy, and he knew it. But he wasn't playing a game. He was learning. Every day they taught him something without realizing it. He noticed patterns. They picked the easiest targets: people who avoided conflict, people who worked long hours, people who didn't have time to question things. They avoided anyone who walked outside with confidence. They avoided people who asked questions. And most of all, they avoided the older man who had told him the truth. They passed his house quickly, almost nervously, as if his calmness scared them. It became clear that their power relied on one thing: people believing they actually had any. One afternoon, a new notice appeared on his door while he was out buying groceries. When he returned, he saw it fluttering under a piece of tape. This one was longer than the others, filled with dramatic words about failing to cooperate, risking further consequences, and continuous violations. He read the entire thing twice, not because he took it seriously, but because he wanted to understand how far they were willing to go. There were no signatures, no contact information, not even proper wording. It looked like something typed quickly by someone who wanted to sound important. Instead of feeling bothered, he felt almost amused. If they truly had power, they wouldn't be trying so hard to convince him of it. He placed the paper on the table, smoothing it flat with his hand. Then he added it to the growing stack in the drawer. The pile was thick, now thicker than he expected. He flipped through the pages slowly, noticing how the tone changed over time. The first papers had sounded almost polite, as if the group didn't want to push too hard. But as weeks passed, the language became sharper, louder, desperate. It showed exactly what he suspected. They were trying to create authority where none existed. The real change began the next morning. He stepped outside to water the small plants he kept near the front porch. The air was cool, and the street was quiet. As he watered the soil, he heard footsteps approaching, soft, hesitant, stopping and starting again. When he turned his head, he saw a woman from 2 houses down, standing on the sidewalk, holding one of the same notices he'd been receiving. She looked nervous, as if she wasn't sure whether she should speak. After a moment, she finally said, "Did they give you one of these too?" He nodded gently. She let out a breath she had clearly been holding for a while, then walked closer, lowering her voice as if she didn't want anyone to hear. She explained that she had been getting notices for months, complaints about her fence, her trash bin, even her curtains. None of the complaints made sense, but she didn't want conflict. So she had tried to fix everything, hoping the group would leave her alone. Instead, they had come back even harder. He listened quietly, letting her talk. She looked embarrassed at one point, saying she felt silly for believing their words. But he didn't see anything silly about it. People trusted what looked official. People wanted to keep peace. Wanting peace wasn't a weakness. It was human. The woman said she had finally talked to another neighbor who told her something surprising. The group had once tried to force him to repaint his house. When he ignored them, they threatened him with fines and formal action. He laughed at them, asked them to show proof, and they never came back. Not once. That detail settled deep in his mind. Silence didn't make someone weak, but fear did. He thanked the woman for sharing and told her gently that none of the papers were legally valid. She looked relieved as if a weight she had carried for months finally lifted. As she walked back to her home, he felt a shift inside himself. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a need for revenge. It was clarity. This wasn't just happening to him. This was happening to many people, and most of them didn't know what to do about it. Later that afternoon, he decided to take a slow walk around the neighborhood again, But this time he wasn't just observing. He was paying close attention. The same older man sat outside his house, resting under the shade of a tree. They exchanged a few words, nothing too heavy, but the older man repeated something important. They only have the power you give them. Those words stayed with him, a few houses down. He saw one of the group members talking to a neighbor. Their voice was loud, forceful, filled with warnings. The neighbor stood with crossed arms, looking uncomfortable but not resisting. When the group member noticed him walking by, they paused mid-sentence and watched him until he passed out of sight. That brief stare said everything at ease. Frustration and something close to fear. He wasn't reacting the way they expected. He wasn't running to fix imaginary problems. He wasn't arguing either. He simply wasn't falling for it. And people who manipulate others hate losing control. The next morning, things escalated. He opened his door and found not one paper but 3. They were taped sloppily, almost angrily, overlapping each other. The words were harsher, the threats more dramatic. It felt like they had rushed to make the papers after waking up irritated that he still wasn't doing what they wanted. He removed the papers calmly and placed them on the kitchen counter. He didn't feel stressed. He didn't even feel bothered. Instead, he felt a strange sort of patience, like he was watching a puzzle slowly solving itself. By now, he had gathered enough information to understand exactly what was happening. The group needed obedience to feel powerful. They needed people to believe them. And most importantly, they needed no one to check the facts. Without real authority, their power was only strong as long as no one asked questions. Later that week, he decided to visit the local records office to clarify something once and for all. It wasn't far. A short drive took him to a quiet building with wide windows and gentle staff who always spoke politely. He explained that he wanted to check the status of his neighborhood's governing body, if any still existed. The woman behind the counter typed for several minutes, then pulled up a document. She rotated the screen slightly so he could read it. The information was clear and simple. The community association had been dissolved years ago due to lack of participation. No board, no committees, no active authority. No one had legal power over the neighborhood not to issue notices, not to conduct inspections, not to demand compliance with made-up rules. Everything the group had been doing was empty, fake, and completely baseless. He thanked the staff member politely, made a few mental notes, and drove home slowly. Thinking about the entire situation, some people might have felt excited about catching the group in a lie, but he didn't feel that way. He felt something softer, something closer to relief. Things finally made sense. Still, he didn't rush to reveal what he knew. He had learned long ago that truth worked best when released at the right moment. He had patience, and patience was something the group lacked. They were driven by the need to feel important. He was driven only by the need for peace. Meanwhile, the group continued their rounds, perhaps unaware of the quiet shift happening. They placed more notices on doors, knocked loudly on houses, and acted as if they controlled every inch of the street. But the neighborhood was beginning to talk. The woman he had spoken to shared what she learned with others. The older man spoke openly to anyone who asked, and slowly, more residents began questioning things. Whispers moved across fences. Conversations took place on porches. People compared notes, and the more they talked, the more they realized how many of them were being pushed around. The group felt the change. He could see it in their behavior. Their voices grew louder whenever he passed by, as if they wanted to remind him they still had control. They spoke more boldly to others. But the neighbors didn't seem as intimidated anymore. Then one afternoon, something interesting happened. He found 2 of the group members standing near his driveway again. They didn't have a notice this time. They simply wanted to talk. Their tone was different, still demanding, but edged with uncertainty. They asked why he had been ignoring their papers, and why he hadn't shown any proof of compliance. He listened without interrupting. When they finished, he simply said, "Show me the legal documents that give you authority. If you have them, I will follow anything you say." They stared at him, stunned again, but this time there was no attempt to argue. One of them opened their mouth, shut it again, and then said something about having the papers in the office. But they didn't say where this office was. They didn't say when the papers would be brought. They simply turned around and left. Walking faster than before, that moment was important, not because it was dramatic, but because it showed the truth, cracking through their confidence. Over the next few days, the neighborhood grew more vocal. One resident confronted the group openly, asking them where their authority came from. Another refused to accept a notice. Someone else tossed a paper back at them during a morning walk. Small actions, but they added up. The group's control was slipping, even if they didn't admit it. He continued collecting every notice they sent him. He didn't speak much, but his quiet presence made them nervous. They didn't know what he was planning or whether he had discovered something. He didn't need to threaten them. He simply needed to exist without fear. By the end of the week, a meeting was announced. Not by the group, by the residents themselves. People wanted answers. People wanted clarity. People wanted to understand who was running the neighborhood and whether anything the group claimed was real. The group couldn't refuse. If they didn't show up, their authority would collapse instantly. If they did show up, they would have to prove themselves. He already knew they couldn't, and as the meeting day approached, the balance of power quietly, steadily shifted. The group still believed they had control, but they were standing on a floor full of cracks. He wasn't planning to embarrass anyone. He wasn't planning any dramatic speech. He simply planned to bring one thing to the meeting: the truth. And the truth, once put in the open, would change everything. The evening before the meeting felt unusually quiet. He sat on his porch for a long time, just listening to the soft sounds of the neighborhood distant footsteps. A dog barking somewhere far off, the wind brushing through the trees. Normally, these sounds blended into the background of his daily life, but now he paid attention to each one. Maybe because he knew something important was about to happen. Maybe because he sensed that after tomorrow, the neighborhood wouldn't feel the same anymore. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't excited either. He felt calm, steady, grounded. He wasn't preparing a speech. He wasn't practicing what to say. He had no interest in dramatic scenes or arguments. He only planned to take the truth with him and let the truth speak for itself. The weight of all the fake notices piled in his drawer was gone from his mind. He didn't feel trapped by them anymore. Instead, he felt as if he had been quietly collecting pieces of clarity for weeks. As night fell, some neighbors walked outside to talk in small groups. The meeting had become the main topic of conversation. People wondered what would happen. Some hoped the group would finally explain themselves. Others were skeptical. A few were still scared, and he understood that. Fear didn't disappear overnight, especially not when a group of people had spent months pretending to be powerful. He didn't join the conversations, not because he didn't care, but because he knew everyone needed space to express their thoughts freely. Sometimes his quiet presence intimidated the group, and he didn't want the neighbors to feel the same way. So he watched from a distance, noticing how the neighborhood seemed to breathe differently that night, more awake, more aware. When he finally went inside, he opened the drawer and looked at the thick stack of notices. There were so many that it almost felt absurd. He flipped through them one more time. The words were loud, but the meaning behind them was empty. Every page was built on fear and assumption. It was strange how something so hollow could make people feel threatened. But that was the nature of illusions. They worked until someone dared to look closely. He placed the entire stack in a bag and set it by the door. Tomorrow, he would bring it to the meeting. Not to embarrass the group, but to show everyone what was really happening. He didn't want to start a fight. He wanted to end confusion. The next morning arrived with bright sunlight and a gentle breeze. A perfect morning for a fresh start, he thought. People were already outside earlier than usual, standing by their driveways, greeting neighbors, discussing what they expected from the meeting. Some looked hopeful, some unsure, some simply tired from months of tension. He stepped outside, with the bag in his hand, and received a few small nods from neighbors who had recently learned the truth. From the older man, or from the woman he'd spoken to. Their nods weren't dramatic, but they were full of meaning. People had begun seeing things clearly. That alone changed the energy of the street. The meeting was scheduled to take place. Under the large tree at the end of the street, a spot everyone knew well. When he arrived, most residents were already gathered. The group of three stood together on the opposite side, holding clipboards as usual. But something was different about them. Their posture wasn't as confident as before. Their shoulders seemed tighter. Their expressions weren't as bold. They looked like people who didn't want to be questioned. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt thick with expectation. Then one of the neighbors, a calm man with a steady voice, stepped forward and said they were all gathered to understand what authority the group believed they had. He didn't sound aggressive, just firm and direct. The group exchanged worried glances. One of them cleared their throat and began explaining how they were maintaining community standards and ensuring everyone followed guidelines. Their tone was rehearsed, but their hands trembled slightly. When someone asked who elected them, the group dodged the question. When another neighbor asked for documents, they claimed the paperwork was being updated. The crowd didn't seem satisfied. He watched quietly, saying nothing. He wanted to give them a chance to speak on their own. He believed in fairness, even toward people who behaved unfairly, but the group continued circling around the same vague explanations. And the more they spoke, the more frustrated residents became. Questions grew sharper. Voices grew louder. The group tried to assert control, insisting they had the right to issue notices, but they couldn't name a single law or rule that supported them. Finally, the neighbor who organized the meeting looked toward him and asked gently if he had anything to add. He didn't rush forward or raise his voice. He simply stepped closer, holding the bag at his side. He told everyone that he had visited the local office to check the status of the neighborhood's governing body. He spoke slowly, clearly, and calmly, making sure everyone understood that the association had been dissolved years ago. There was no board, no committee, no one with official authority to give out warnings or penalties. Not one of the group's papers had any legal value. Then he placed the bag on a small table and opened it. One by one, he took out the notices, one different in wording but identical in emptiness, and placed them on the table. The pile grew high. The sight of it made people gasp softly. They weren't shocked at him. They were shocked at the extent of the group's actions. Seeing all the fake notices together made everything clearer. What had felt intimidating before now looked almost ridiculous. The group froze. Their faces turned pale. They glanced at each other with panic hidden behind stiff smiles. One of them tried to speak, but their voice cracked. They insisted they were only trying to help the community. Another tried to defend the notices by saying they were guidelines rather than rules. But the residents weren't fooled anymore. Questions flooded the group faster. Now real questions, pointed questions, questions they could no longer dodge. How long had they been doing this? Why did they hide their identities? Why did they target certain houses more than others? Who told them they had authority? The group shrank under the weight of those questions. Their loud, confident voices faded into small, shaky sentences. Their clipboards, once symbols of their self-given power, now looked like props in a bad play. One resident finally said, "What everyone was thinking. You acted like you had power because you thought no one would ask questions." Silence followed. A long, heavy silence. The group had no answer. He stood there quietly, not smiling, not angry, just calm. He didn't raise his voice or celebrate. He looked at the group with the same patience he had shown them for weeks. He didn't want to humiliate them, but the truth was out now. There was no going back. Another neighbor suggested creating a real committee, one chosen openly, with clear rules and fair communication. Someone else agreed. Voices rose with ideas and hopes. People were ready for clarity. People were ready for fairness. People wanted peace again, not fake peace built on fear, but real peace built on honesty. While neighbors talked, the group of three slowly stepped back, no longer the center of attention. Their clipboards hung loosely in their hands. They avoided everyone's eyes. Without control, they looked small. Not because others made them feel small, but because the illusion they created had finally broken. Later, as the crowd slowly dispersed, one of the group members approached him quietly. Their voice was soft, nothing like the loud tone they had used before. They said they hadn't meant to cause harm. They just wanted the neighborhood to look organized. They thought people would respect them if they sounded official. He listened without interrupting. Their explanation didn't excuse their actions, but he understood something important. People sometimes tried to feel important in the wrong ways. Fear didn't always come from cruelty sometimes. It came from insecurity. He told them calmly that there were better ways to help a community. Real ways. Honest ways. They nodded slowly, then walked away, unsure of what to do next. Over the next few days, the neighborhood felt lighter. People walked with more confidence. Conversations were warmer. The older man under the tree laughed loudly for the first time in a long while. The woman who had been afraid to speak now greeted neighbors with a smile. Even those who rarely came outside seemed more relaxed. The group didn't walk around with clipboards anymore. They stayed quiet, staying to themselves, maybe thinking about everything that had happened. And though they avoided him for the first few days, they weren't hostile. Just embarrassed and unsure, he didn't hold anything against them. One morning, he saw one of the group members cleaning an area near the community mailbox. They weren't ordering anyone around. They weren't pretending to be in charge. They were simply cleaning, quietly, willingly. Maybe that was their way of starting over. He nodded at them as he walked by. They nodded back. A small but meaningful gesture. Days passed peacefully. The neighbors met again and created a simple volunteer plan to keep the street clean and friendly. Nothing complicated. No power struggles. No fake authority. Just people helping people. And through it all, he stayed the same calm, observant, respectful. But everyone saw him differently now. Not as the quiet man who stayed in the background, but as someone who brought truth to light. Without raising his voice, they thought he had no power. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought they could control the neighborhood forever, but they were wrong. The truth changed everything, and more change was still coming. The next morning came quietly, almost too quietly. The street that usually felt loud, with passing cars and early conversations, seemed still, like it was waiting for something. He sat at the small table near the window with a warm cup of tea in his hands. He wasn't thinking about winning or proving anything anymore. He was thinking about the truth, and how the truth had a strange way of showing itself at the right time, even when no one expected it. Before he could take his second sip, his phone buzzed. It was a message that simply said, "We need to talk. Please pick up." It was from the same board member who had been trying to act tough the night before. Something about the message felt different. There was no attitude this time. No controlling tone. It sounded more like worry. He didn't call back right away. He finished his tea, took a deep breath, and stepped outside for a short walk. Sometimes stepping away for a moment helped him think clearly. Halfway down the street, he saw the board member standing near the community park. He looked uneasy, pacing slowly, hands in his pockets, head down. As soon as he noticed him approaching, he straightened up. "Thanks for coming," the board member said softly. "I didn't agree to anything." "I was just passing by," he replied calmly. The board member gave a nervous smile, like someone who had been awake all night. "Look, something happened. Something none of us saw coming." He waited, saying nothing. He didn't want to make assumptions. He didn't want to rush the moment. The board member took a deep breath. "There's been a review of the complaints. An outside consultant went through everything. The claims made against you, they don't hold up at all." He paused, watching his reaction. "And that's not even the main issue." He folded his arms, listening. Quiet moments like these could reveal more than loud speeches. There were mistakes, the board member continued. Serious ones. Someone altered records. Someone pushed things further than they should have. Someone wanted control. More than fairness. None of this truly surprised him, but hearing it out loud made everything feel heavier. He didn't say anything. He let the silence speak for him. The board member lowered his voice. "I think you already know who it was." "Did?" Everyone did. The president had been acting like the community belonged to her alone. She enjoyed authority too much. She didn't like being questioned. She didn't like when someone refused to be intimidated. She liked the idea of power, just not the responsibility that came with it. "So what now?" he asked quietly. The board member sighed. "There's going to be a meeting today. A real one. An open one. We need you there. Things are changing faster than we expected." He nodded, though he wasn't excited. Meetings like these had a way of turning messy. But if this was the moment where the truth finally stepped forward, he didn't want to walk away from it. Later that afternoon, the community hall was filled with more people than he had ever seen before. Some looked confused, some nervous, some angry. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that sat on everyone's shoulders. He stayed near the back, not wanting to be the center of anything. That wasn't who he was, and it never had been. The president walked in, trying to keep her usual confident stride, but it didn't look natural today. She could feel the shift in the room. Eyes didn't follow her this time. They watched her, judged her, measured her. The board member who had spoken to him earlier stood up and addressed the room. "We're here because there have been concerns about the way things have been handled. A review was done, and the findings are troubling." Murmurs filled the room. People leaned closer to hear. No one expected honesty from the board. "Not like this," another board member read from a printed sheet. Several records were adjusted without proper approval. Complaints were filed without clear evidence. Notices were issued that went beyond policy. And one homeowner, he paused, looking toward him, was placed under unnecessary pressure. People turned to look at him, some with sympathy, some with curiosity. He kept his eyes forward, calm and steady. The president suddenly stood. "This is being taken out of context," she said sharply. Everything done was in the best interest of the community. The board didn't respond at first. The silence made her even more uneasy. Finally, the board member spoke. "This goes beyond context. We found your approval on documents that never went through a full vote. You made decisions on behalf of everyone without consulting anyone. That isn't leadership. That's misuse of authority." The room erupted with voices, some in disbelief, some in frustration, some saying they had suspected something all along, for the first time since the entire conflict began. The president looked genuinely uncertain. Her voice trembled slightly as she tried to defend herself, but the weight of the truth was too heavy now. No one was arguing on her behalf. No one was stepping up to rescue her reputation. The same people who once supported her blindly now wanted answers. He stood quietly in the back, not enjoying her downfall, not seeking revenge, but simply observing what truth looked like when it finally revealed itself. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was just steady, like sunlight breaking through the clouds. The board announced that a temporary leadership committee would take over until a proper election could be held. The president would step down effective immediately. The room filled with a mixture of relief and shock. Someone approached him, a neighbor who had kept their distance through the entire ordeal. "I'm sorry," they said quietly. "We should have asked questions earlier. We should have listened." He shook his head gently. "People believe what they're shown. It's not your fault." As the meeting wrapped up, people started talking to each other in softer voices. The tension slowly faded. What once felt like a battle now felt like a deep exhale after months of holding in breath. The board member approached him again. "Thank you for your patience through all of this," he said. "You didn't fight with anger. You didn't shout. You just waited for the truth. Most people don't have that kind of patience." He looked out at the crowd, the same people who had once doubted him. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the truth needs silence to grow." He walked home slowly, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The street that once felt tense now looked peaceful. Children were playing. Neighbors were talking. Life was shifting back to normal. But something inside him had shifted too. He realized that power wasn't about who spoke the loudest or who made the boldest claims. Real power came from character, from calmness, from knowing the truth even when others couldn't see it yet. The day wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode with action. It unfolded the same way truth always did, step by step, quietly but undeniably, and he knew this wasn't the end. There was still something bigger coming. something that would explain the entire story in a way no one saw coming. The truth had only started to show itself, and soon everything would make sense. The days that followed were strangely calm, like the air after a long storm. People who used to avoid him now stopped to greet him. Some apologized quietly, some smiled awkwardly, some simply nodded as if they were trying to undo months of distance with one small gesture. He didn't hold anything against anyone. He never did. He always believed that misunderstandings didn't make people bad. They just made people human. He spent the first morning after the meeting sitting on his porch, watching the sun rise slowly over the rooftops. The light touched each house gently, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The heavy weight he carried on his shoulders for months had finally lifted. But he knew the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Something inside him kept whispering that the truth hadn't fully revealed itself. There were pieces still missing, pieces that would explain why everything had spiraled the way it did. That explanation came sooner than he expected. Late in the afternoon, he received a call from the temporary committee. Their tone was calm but serious. They asked him to visit the community office for a talk. This time, it wasn't a warning or a demand. They simply wanted to explain something. He agreed and walked toward the office, not feeling anxious but curious. When he arrived, the committee members were already waiting. They didn't sit behind a long table like before. Instead, they pulled chairs into a loose circle, making the room feel warmer. Almost like a living room conversation, one of the members spoke first. "We thought you deserved to know the full truth," she said. "There are details we only discovered after the president stepped down." He nodded, giving her space to continue. "What happened wasn't just about power or ego," she said carefully. "There was a financial issue involved. A mistake that snowballed into something much bigger. Instead of admitting it, the former president tried to cover it up. The strict notices, the pressure, the altered records, those were attempts to distract the community from the real issue." He listened without interrupting. The pieces were starting to connect. The member continued. Funds meant for community repairs were used improperly. When questions started rising, she feared the blame would fall entirely on her. So she tried to show she was taking action elsewhere. To shift attention, "You became part of the distraction without even knowing it." He sat back slowly, not angry, not shocked, just thoughtful. Another member added, "We're not proud of what happened. We should have noticed the inconsistencies earlier. We should have asked more questions. The community depended on us to lead responsibly, and we failed." You could feel genuine regret in their voices. Not forced. Not political. Real. After a moment of quiet, he said softly, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after you see the truth." The committee looked relieved to hear that. The tension in the room softened, but there was more. The member who had been silent until now cleared his throat. "There's something else. Something surprising." He pulled out a small folder and placed it on the table between them. "This is why we wanted to talk to you face to face." The room fell silent again. The member gently pushed the folder toward him. "You weren't just targeted randomly. You were chosen because you asked a question months ago, one small question that made her nervous." He frowned slightly, trying to remember. "You asked for transparency," the member explained. "You asked for a copy of the budget? Most people don't request things like that. But you did. And that simple question made her believe you were looking too closely." Then he remembered. It had been a casual request. He wasn't accusing anyone. He just wanted to understand how the community funds were being used. He had always been someone who believed in clarity. He didn't know that one simple request created a chain reaction of fear in someone who was hiding too much. Now it all made sense. He looked at the folder for a long moment before opening it. Inside were printed statements, notes, and written explanations. It showed the full picture: how the first mistake happened, how panic spread, how someone tried to hide instead of confessing, and how he unknowingly became part of a story he never wanted to be in. He closed the folder slowly. The truth was not dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or chaos. It came quietly, like a puzzle finally fitting together. The committee member said gently, We wanted to make sure you knew everything. You deserved to." He nodded again, appreciating their honesty. There was something comforting about seeing people choose integrity even after a long series of mistakes. As he got up to leave, one member stopped him. "Before you go," she said, "there's something we've been talking about. The community needs new leadership people who don't get carried away with authority. People who stay calm, even when things get complicated. You've shown that. More than you realize." He raised his eyebrows slowly, unsure what she meant. She continued, "We want you to consider joining the new committee." He was genuinely surprised. He had never tried to be in charge of anything. He never wanted a title or responsibility over others. He just wanted fairness. Just wanted calm. "I'm not sure I'm the right person," he said quietly. "You are," she replied without hesitation. "Not because you want power, but because you don't." The words hit him softly in a way he didn't expect. He promised to think about it, and they didn't push him. They simply thanked him for coming and walked him to the door. As he stepped outside, the evening breeze brushed against his face. The sky was turning orange soft, calm, peaceful. He walked home slowly, letting his thoughts settle. When he reached his house, sat on his porch again, watching, breathing, thinking. He realized something important. All this time, people thought they had power through authority, through titles, through loud instructions and strict warnings. But the truth was different. Real power wasn't about control. Real power came from honesty, from patience, from doing the right thing even when no one was watching. The former president had tried to build strength through fear. It had worked for a short time, but fear always falls apart once the truth appears, and the truth did appear, not in a dramatic explosion. Not in a big fight. It appeared quietly, gently, piece by piece. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of closure. He knew life would go on. The street would return to normal. The community would rebuild trust. People would learn from what happened, and he would continue living the same way he always had. Calm, steady, honest. Maybe he would join the committee. Maybe he wouldn't. He hadn't decided yet. But for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of the choice, not controlled by others. Not pressured, just free. He smiled softly at the fading light in the sky. They thought they had power, but the truth changed everything, and it always would.